1754. A hot-headed 22-year-old gives one reckless order in a dark American forest and sets the world on fire. Europe, Africa, India, a world war. His name? George Washington. Yes, that Washington. The man who accidentally ignited the 7 Years' War, became the first democratically elected president in modern history. How does the arsonist of a world war become the father of democracy and then give the power back? This is that story. To truly understand Washington, you must first understand exactly what he lacked. His father died suddenly when George was only 11 years old, leaving all the wealth, land, and attention to the older half-brother Lawrence. George was just the neglected second son. While his older brothers traveled across the ocean to study at Oxford, George was left behind on the farm with a very basic, primitive education. This painful deprivation planted a deep narcissistic wound inside his heart. He looked at the high-ranking British officers with their bright red coats, shiny swords, and polished language, and he felt deeply inferior. He burned with an agonizing desire to be one of them, to speak like them, to be recognized as a true gentleman. To compensate for his massive insecurities, he began a relentless process of self-fabrication. He found an old book called The Rules of Civility and obsessively copied it by hand. He practiced before his mirror for hours on end, watching visiting nobles and perfectly mimicking their graceful moves. He was acting the role of the refined, elite man, so skillfully and so persistently. His ambition back then wasn't about freeing America or fighting tyranny. It was much narrower and far more selfish. He dreamed of obtaining a royal commission in the British Army, just to prove his worth to the men who looked down on him. He foolishly thought that courage meant blind recklessness, and that leadership meant having the loudest voice in the room. He didn't know that a harsh, bloody lesson awaited him deep in the dark woods, ready to teach him the true meaning of humility. At 22 years old, an arrogant Washington was sent to the wild Ohio woods to warn the French army. The dense forests were dark, wild, and incredibly tense. Washington was a hot-headed young man, desperately looking for any excuse to fight. He allied with a ruthless indigenous chief named the Half-King. They stumbled upon a small, isolated camp of Frenchmen, peacefully sleeping in a valley called Jumonville Glen. A wise, seasoned commander would have negotiated, but Washington? He gave the sudden order to fire immediately. It was a quick, completely unjustified massacre. The wounded French commander crawled forward and tried to raise his hand, screaming that he carried a diplomatic message of peace. But before the Frenchman could finish his sentence, the indigenous chief struck, splitting the diplomat's skull with a heavy tomahawk. He washed his hands in the warm blood right before a stunned Washington, who had completely lost control of his own raid. He had murdered a diplomatic envoy in peacetime. The French Empire went absolutely mad with rage. They hunted Washington down and trapped him in a pathetic, flooding stockade called Fort Necessity under heavy rain and constant humiliating insults. They forced the broken boy to surrender and sign a legal document written entirely in French, a language he couldn't read. Unknowingly, Washington signed a formal confession, legally admitting to the cold-blooded assassination of the French ambassador. This single, stupid document was the spark that ignited the catastrophic 7 Years' War. Imagine that. One young, arrogant man, with one reckless, emotional decision, started a massive world war stretching all the way from the forests of Europe to the shores of India. He returned home with his fragile reputation completely dragged through the mud. Newspapers called him a dangerous fool. The elite British officers openly mocked him. It was a brutal, bone-crushing lesson. Recklessness is not courage, and pulling a trigger does not make you a leader. A year later, he returned to those same haunted woods, serving under the highly arrogant British General Braddock. Braddock openly mocked the indigenous warriors and foolishly marched his bright red regular army in tight parade formation right through the dense forest. Suddenly, the gates of hell violently opened at the Battle of Monongahela. The French and indigenous fighters ambushed them from behind the heavy trees. The British soldiers in their glowing red coats were nothing but sitting ducks in a slaughterhouse. Absolute panic spread like a virus. General Braddock was shot and fell dead. The professional regular army collapsed completely, soldiers crying, running and trampling each other in the mud. Elite officers simply froze in terror, unable to fight an invisible enemy. But amidst this bloody apocalypse, the new, legendary George Washington was finally born. While everyone else fled for their lives, Washington, who was severely sick with a fever, mounted his horse, riding straight through the hail of bullets to organize the chaotic retreat. He was a massive, clear target, tall and commanding on his horse. Bullets whistled past his ears, and the snipers aimed specifically at his chest to kill the prominent leader. But after the smoke cleared, the miracle was revealed. Washington took off his coat and found 4 separate bullet holes tearing right through the fabric. His hat was shot off his head, but his physical body? Not a single, solitary scratch. Washington returned a national hero, but he had learned a dark, pragmatic lesson. Military glory does not pay your bills, and the British officers would never truly respect him because he wasn't born English. So, he resigned from the army. He decided to build unshakable power another way: money and land. He strategically married Martha Custis, the wealthiest young widow in all of Virginia. She wasn't just a romantic partner, she was an entire economic empire wrapped in a wedding dress. With the simple words, "I do," Washington instantly gained control of 17,000 acres of prime land and thousands of pounds in cash. This massive wealth finally freed him. He no longer needed a pathetic salary from the British Crown. He devoted himself to managing Mount Vernon with the sharp wit of a fierce merchant. So when the British Parliament began imposing heavy taxes, Washington's anger wasn't just a high-minded political theory, it was deeply economic. He saw the arrogant English merchants literally stealing his hard-earned profits with unfair debts and trade restrictions. He transformed from an obedient officer seeking the king's favor into an independent, wealthy businessman who hated anyone touching his money. He had the wealth, the reputation, the motive, and the steel character. In 1775, the desperate Continental Congress officially chose George Washington to lead the newly formed American Army. Why him? Because he was tall, incredibly rich, entirely silent, and the only man smart enough to attend the political meetings wearing his full military uniform. But he soon realized he took command of a complete illusion. When he arrived at the camp, he found a chaotic rabble of dirty farmers with rusty guns who didn't know how to march and who openly cursed their officers without a shred of respect. The army's entire gunpowder supply was literally only enough for 9 rounds per soldier, and he was being asked to defeat the mighty British Empire? It was a sick, twisted joke, a suicide mission that Washington accepted with a heavy heart. The real bone-crushing test came in New York, 1776. The largest British invasion fleet in human history appeared on the horizon. 400 massive warships, a terrifying forest of wooden masts completely blocking out the sun. They landed and utterly crushed Washington's fragile army in Brooklyn. American soldiers dropped their weapons and ran at the very first shot like terrified rats. Washington rode among them, furiously whipping his own men with his hat and cane. He screamed to the heavens, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" He genuinely wished for a British bullet to strike him dead on the battlefield, from the sheer burning shame he felt watching his army collapse. The army was completely trapped, with the deep river behind them and the massive British war machine in front. The end was mathematically certain by morning: capture, mass execution, or death for every single leader of the revolution. But Washington pulled off a logistical miracle. He used a dense, incredibly thick fog that settled late at night to evacuate 9,000 soldiers in small wooden boats. They rode in total dead silence right under the sleeping enemy's nose. It was a legendary, masterfully executed evacuation. Washington was the very last person to step into the final boat. When the morning sun finally rose, the heavily armed British troops charged, only to find the American trenches completely empty. He lost the city of New York, yes, but he saved the vital army from total annihilation. He learned a harsh truth that night. A smart, calculated retreat is 1,000 times better than a stupid, heroic stand that ends your very existence. The humiliating defeat in New York changed Washington's mind forever. He completely abandoned the romantic idea of traditional military honor and nightly face-to-face clashes. He swallowed his pride and accepted a bitter truth. I cannot beat them in an open field. He decided to adopt the ancient Fabian strategy. The philosophy was incredibly simple and utterly genius. I do not have to win major battles to win this war. I just need to make sure my army does not die. He turned his entire army into a ghost. Hit and run, always retreating into the hills, refusing to enter a decisive, large-scale battle except on his own careful terms. He made his army into quicksilver that the slow British simply couldn't catch. But this required immense, agonizing psychological discipline. The politicians in Congress scolded him, openly calling him a coward. The local newspapers mocked him relentlessly, sarcastically dubbing him the General of Retreats. His massive ego was bleeding badly. But his rational mind remained in absolute control. He knew that one single moment of vanity, one reckless charge to satisfy his ego, could end the revolution and the American dream forever. He swallowed the insults and kept marching backward. His goal was no longer to destroy the British army, but to prolong the war indefinitely. He wanted to buy precious time until the British public got bored, the king's treasury emptied, and they simply decided the colonies weren't worth the massive cost. Washington decided to win the war through weaponized boredom and extreme patience, not knockout blows. He turned the vast American continent into a deep, muddy quagmire, where the heavy British army would slowly sink and exhaust itself. If his army was physically weak in weapons, his information network had to be terrifyingly strong. Washington turned into a brilliant, ruthless spymaster. He founded the highly secretive Culper Ring right in the dark heart of British-occupied New York. He managed the spy ring himself in total secrecy. He utilized technology far ahead of his time, like invisible ink that only appeared when washed with a specific chemical, tannic acid. He used complex, unbreakable numerical codes. Washington was a supreme master of disinformation. He would deliberately write fake, highly detailed military documents about a massive, impending American attack, and let those papers get conveniently lost for the British spies to find, forcing them to mass troops in the wrong place. While the enemy panicked and prepared for a phantom attack, Washington struck swiftly elsewhere. He completely manipulated the minds of aristocratic British generals, making them chase ghosts in the woods. He defeated them with his brain before firing a single bullet. Washington acted the role of the fearless, confident leader so incredibly well that the entire army fully believed the performance, and eventually, Washington believed it himself. The mask became the face. December 1776. The American Revolution is literally taking its final, agonizing breath. Washington had lost New York, lost New Jersey, and his massive army shrank from 20,000 confident men to just 3,000 freezing, starving survivors. But the worst part was the ticking clock. Most of the soldiers' enlistment contracts officially expired on December 31st, meaning in a matter of days, he wouldn't have an army at all. The men would simply drop their guns and go home. He desperately needed a massive, shocking victory, and he needed it fast. He stared at the map and locked his eyes on Trenton, where the fearsome Hessian mercenaries were comfortably camped. He decided to take the absolute most dangerous, insane gamble of his life. Christmas night, a brutal, freezing blizzard violently battered the region. The dark river was packed with massive, lethal chunks of ice. Any sane, logical military commander would have canceled the attack immediately. But Washington aggressively ordered the boats into the water. The secret password for that freezing night was terrifyingly clear: victory or death. There was absolutely no third option. They either won or they died in the snow. The scene was heartbreakingly legendary. Soldiers dressed in literal rags, many entirely barefoot, wrapping their freezing feet in torn burlap sacks. Washington stood tall in the rocking boat, completely silent, staring dead ahead at the opposite bank. He knew this was all or nothing. At dawn, they violently attacked the sleeping Hessians, who were completely exhausted and caught off guard by the severe winter storm. The aggressive surprise was shocking and absolute. Total chaos violently ripped through the enemy ranks. In just 45 minutes of fierce fighting, 1,000 elite Hessian mercenaries threw down their weapons and surrendered to a gang of freezing farmers. And miraculously, not a single American soldier was killed by enemy fire. Only 2 men died, freezing to death in the snow during the brutal march. This military victory was physically small, but psychologically, it was massive. It instantly saved the revolution's morale from clinical permanent death. It proved to the terrified Americans that the giant could be beaten, and that Washington was not just a retreating coward, but a hungry wolf who knew exactly when to bite. But Mother Nature showed absolutely no mercy. During the brutal winter encampments that followed, peaking at Morristown and Valley Forge, the true test of the human soul began. The army camped in the freezing open with no food, no shoes, and no blankets. Soldiers survived by eating fire cakes, a miserable, tasteless paste of flour and dirty water baked on a hot rock. Horrific diseases like typhoid and smallpox swept through the camp, harvesting the weak men by the hundreds every single week. Here, Washington's deeply human side finally emerged. The politicians in Congress ordered him to seize food from the local farmers by military force, but he flatly refused to steal from his own people just to feed his army. Instead of leaving them to live in a warm, comfortable mansion in the city, he pitched his own modest tent right among the soldiers in the freezing snow. He ate the same miserable food they ate and froze just as they froze. It was during these brutal winter campaigns that he took a massive, terrifying medical risk. He secretly ordered the inoculation of the entire army against smallpox, using primitive, highly dangerous methods. If it failed, he would have killed his own army. But the bold risk paid off. The death rate plummeted. His physical presence among them, sharing their extreme hunger and biting cold, created a sacred, unbreakable bond of loyalty. The men no longer fought for the abstract idea of independence. They fought for George, the man who refused to leave them to die alone in the dark. In the depths of this despair, a strange character arrived at the camp. Baron von Steuben, a flamboyant Prussian officer who loudly claimed to be a great European general and who didn't speak a single word of English. Washington, in his immense humility, didn't care about the man's fake resume or his language barrier. He looked into the man's eyes and saw pure competence and military fire. So he immediately handed him the training of the entire Continental Army. When the army finally marched out of Valley Forge in the spring, they were no longer a ragtag gang of rebels. They were a highly disciplined military machine, fully capable of standing toe-to-toe with the elite British redcoats in open ground. But the war itself refused to die. In 1778, France, his old enemy from the Ohio woods, officially joined the American side, hungry for revenge against Britain. The empire he had once enraged as a reckless boy was now his salvation. Suddenly, the Ghost Army had a navy. 3 more years of brutal stalemate followed, until one piece of golden intelligence changed everything. 1781. The war had dragged on for 6 long years. Britain was exhausted, America bankrupt. Washington knew this was the last chance. He received golden intelligence. The British Army under Lord Cornwallis was trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, waiting for supplies from the sea. Action-oriented. Washington, who was planning to retake New York, changed plans with stunning flexibility. He marched his army 400 miles south in total secrecy, while the French fleet sealed off the ocean. The trap snapped shut. The land blocked by Washington, the sea by the French. The bombardment lasted for days and nights until Yorktown turned into hell. On October 19, 1781, the British Army surrendered. They marched out playing a song titled "The World Turned Upside Down." They were right. A group of farmers had defeated the greatest military machine on Earth. Yorktown wasn't just a victory, it was a birth certificate. Washington proved that strategic patience, the Fabian strategy, pays off in the end, no matter how long it takes. But victory brought a dangerous new problem: a massive, armed, victorious army that hadn't been paid in years, and that is the fuel of coups. The danger was no longer from the British, but from inside the American camp itself. Washington was about to face the hardest moment of his life. 1783. The army camped at Newburgh. Officers were furious. Congress was broke and refused to pay them. Calls for mutiny and a military coup began to spread. The officers wanted to march on Philadelphia, force Congress to pay at gunpoint, and potentially install Washington as a military dictator. Washington knew he could have used this anger to seize the crown. Instead, he called an emergency meeting with all officers at the Temple of Virtue. He entered the hall. The air was thick with hate and anger. He stood before them and began reading a speech he wrote to convince them of patience and loyalty to the Republic. But the words didn't work. Faces remained cold and angry. Washington felt he was losing them. He stopped reading and pulled a letter from a congressman out of his pocket. He tried to read it, but the print was small. He pulled out a pair of reading glasses. No one had ever seen him wear them. He sighed, his voice breaking. "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." That sentence landed like lightning. The hardened officers began to weep. They saw not the strict general, but the human who sacrificed his youth, health, and sight for them. In a single moment, rage turned to shame. The mutiny melted away in tears, not bullets. Washington walked out, knowing the coup was over. After quelling the mutiny, the historic moment arrived. December 1783. Washington goes to Congress in Annapolis. The whole world is watching. What will the victor do? In Europe, kings don't retire. The victor takes the throne. But Washington entered the hall, stood before the civilian Congress, and removed his hat in respect. He pulled out his speech, hands shaking with emotion, rare for him. He said with a quivering voice, "Having finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action." He surrendered his sword and his commission. He voluntarily gave up absolute power to become a private citizen. The room dissolved into tears at the sheer magnitude of the act. When King George III heard the news, he couldn't believe it. He said his famous line, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." This act is why the American Revolution succeeded, while the French and Russian revolutions later failed and turned into bloody dictatorships. Washington broke the cursed cycle of history. He proved that power is not war booty, but a temporary trust to be returned to its owners. 4 years later, America was a failed state. The government was weak, states were bickering, chaos reigned. They called for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. Washington hesitated. He was sick and wanted rest. But he realized his absence meant failure. He attended and was unanimously elected president of the convention. Through the hot summer months, while geniuses like Madison and Hamilton argued over the Constitution, Washington did something strange. He stayed silent. He barely spoke. He sat on the high chair watching and listening. But his silent presence was the gravity keeping the room from exploding. Delegates looked at him and felt ashamed of their petty fights. His aura enforced discipline. They were drafting the office of president while looking at him. They designed the president's powers to fit George Washington. They trusted a strong executive only because they knew Washington would fill it first. When the Constitution was signed, Franklin said he saw America's sun finally rising. Washington was that sun, melting differences with his silent heat. He returned home, but knew the peace wouldn't last. Letters poured in. "You are the only man who can unite us." With a heavy heart, Washington agreed to run for president, not for love of power, but for fear that everything he fought for would be lost. April 1789. Washington takes the oath as the first president. The problem? There is no manual. No one knows how a president acts. Is he a king? An employee? Congress drowned in ridiculous debates over titles. Some proposed, "His Highness the Protector of our Liberties." Washington rejected all royal pomp. He chose the simple title, Mr. President. Humble, yet carrying democratic dignity. He set the tone of the republic forever. But he knew simple didn't mean cheap. Washington designed a strict protocol. He held weekly levees, wearing fine velvet and a ceremonial sword. He shook hands with no one, bowing instead. He understood people needed a symbol to respect. Washington's administrative genius showed in his cabinet. He didn't pick obedient friends, he picked rival geniuses. He appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. The two men hated each other blindly, representing opposite visions. Jefferson wanted a weak government and an agrarian America. Hamilton wanted a strong central government, banks, and industry. The conflict was fierce and daily. Thanks to this dissonant cabinet, the foundations of the U.S. economy and foreign policy were built in record time. The most dangerous security test came in 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers in Pennsylvania refused to pay the alcohol tax, armed themselves, and attacked tax collectors. It was a direct threat to federal authority. If a state rebelled without punishment, America would fracture. Washington tried negotiation first, but they refused. Here Washington took off the politician's mask and put on the general's mask for the last time. He summoned the militia, gathering an army of 13,000 men. He mounted his horse and led the army into the field himself. This is the only time in history a sitting U.S. president has led troops in battle. The message was terrifying and clear. Laws passed by elected representatives must be obeyed, or the sword will decide. As soon as the rebels saw Washington's massive army and the old lion on his horse, the rebellion evaporated. They fled home without firing a shot. Washington won with prestige and terror. He arrested the ringleaders and sentenced them to death for treason. But in a final dramatic twist, he used the presidential pardon. He forgave them. He said he wanted to prove the government's strength, not seek revenge. He proved democracy doesn't mean chaos, and freedom needs power to protect its borders. In his second term, war erupted between France and Britain. Americans loved France, their ally, and hated Britain. The streets demanded war on France's side. But Washington was a cold pragmatist. He knew America was young, bankrupt, and had no real army. Entering a world war now meant suicide. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality and sent John Jay to sign a trade treaty with Britain. This decision was a political bomb. Public rage exploded against him. Papers that once worshipped him began cursing him, calling him a traitor, a British agent, and a tyrant. Washington was deeply hurt. He said he was abused like a common pickpocket, but he didn't back down. He knew he was sacrificing his popularity for his country's survival. He saw the future. America needed 20 years of peace to build its economy. War now would destroy everything. He preferred to be hated and a savior, than loved and a destroyer. He stood like a rock in the storm. Thanks to this decision, America avoided war, trade boomed, and the economy that would become a superpower was built. 1796. Elections are approaching. The Constitution didn't limit terms. Washington could have been president until death, and everyone expected it. Politicians begged him to stay for a third term. They feared the state would fall apart without him. "You are the glue holding America," they said. But Washington had a different view. He was exhausted, yes, but thinking strategically. If I die in office, I will have established a disguised monarchy. He wanted to see the transfer of power to another while alive. He wanted to prove the system is stronger than the man. He decided to step down. This decision established the two-term tradition honored by every president until it became law. Washington bound himself to free the future. Napoleon couldn't let go and ended in exile. Caesar held on and ended murdered. Washington let go and ended revered. He knew the Republic's worst enemy wasn't the British Army, but the love of power in every human heart. He decided to kill this enemy with his final act. Leaving power was his greatest political lesson. He told the world, "Graveyards are full of men who thought the world couldn't run without them, yet life goes on." Before leaving, Washington wrote his farewell address. He didn't speak it, he published it in newspapers as a letter to the people of the United States. This document is the holiest political text after the Constitution. It was full of prophetic warnings we see coming true today. He warned fiercely against political parties. He said partisanship would make men loyal to the party over the nation, opening the door to corruption and foreign influence. He warned against permanent alliances. He said, "Nations have no permanent friends, only permanent interests." He advised neutrality and focusing on internal strength. Today, this address is read annually in Congress, but few follow it. Washington left the map, but politicians after him lost the compass. March 1797. Washington hands power to John Adams. He walks out of the inauguration, a private citizen. Crowds follow him in thousands in silent awe. He returned to his beloved Mount Vernon. These were his happiest days. He said, "I feel like a prisoner released from his chains." He spent his last days riding his horse, checking crops, fixing fences. He returned to being Farmer George, not the general or president. But he suffered. His false teeth hurt, his hearing faded, his body was worn by wars, but his soul was at rest. December 1799. Washington rides out in rain and snow. He returns sick with a severe throat infection. His condition worsens rapidly. Doctors, in their ignorance, bled him, weakening him and hastening his death. Washington realized it was the end. His last words were, "'Tis well." He died in control of himself even in the final struggle. When news broke, the world mourned. Even Napoleon in France ordered flags lowered. The British fleet, his old enemy, lowered flags in honor. The world knew it lost a man who could not be replaced. A man who held absolute power, used it for good, then left it voluntarily. He was buried at his farm simply, as requested, without a massive state funeral. He lived as a Titan and died as a citizen. At the start, I asked you, how does the arsonist of a world war become the father of democracy? Now you know. It began with a neglected boy practicing manners in a mirror, desperate to be noticed. That boy crossed frozen rivers. He buried his men in the snow. He swallowed betrayal, mockery, and rage, and conquered the only enemy greater than any empire, himself. And when the whole world finally lay in his hands, he opened them and let it go. Kings die clutching their crowns. Washington died whispering, "'Tis well." He leaves you with one question. You are building your empire, but who rules you? Tell me in the comments which moment defined Washington for you, the frozen river or the returned sword. If this journey moved you, hit like and subscribe. History's titans left behind their blueprints, and we are just getting started.